Okay, before we even get started, we need to acknowledge, yes, my hair does not look great. It is currently like day 3 hair, and so there's only so much I can do with water and product to make it look normal and not a lion's mane, so we're just working with what we got. And that's that. So anyway, welcome back to another video. My name is Mallory, and today I want to talk about my 24 favorite books that I read in 2024. So at this point in time, I have read 63 books, and so low-key narrowing that down to 25 was kind of hard, and not because I read so many great books, which I did, but other than like my top 10 favorite books, it was hard to distinguish between my like 4-star reads that I thought were like above and beyond the others. So this list was kind of really hard to figure out. So in terms of these books, the only rules for myself were that I'm not allowed to pick books that I've reread this year. And in terms of series, I'm only allowed to pick more than one book from the same series if it is an interconnected standalone. And then in terms of the actual like ranking, I tried my best to rank them from 1 to 24, but it was kind of hard. Like, you know, I have my top like 10 books on here that were absolute 5 stars, favorite books of the year. And then after that, it gets a little bit of mushy and mixed up because like I love all these books for kind of different reasons. They're kind of different genres. So just beyond my top like 10, it's kind of a mishmash, and I'm not super happy with like the ranking, but it is what it is. And regardless of where it is on the ranking, it's still one of my 24 favorite books of the year. So I'm actually gonna start with book 24 and work our way up to number 1, just to kind of start, not negative, but work our way up to the more exciting books that I really loved this year. And so book 24 on this list is Turtles All the Way Down by John Green. And this is one of the few John Green books that I hadn't read yet, and I finally read it. I think what pushed me to read it was because I believe the movie was published this year. I could be totally wrong, but I think the movie adaptation for this came out this year. Still haven't watched it, but I know that came out fairly recently, if not this year, then late last year. But this book basically follows Aza, who has OCD, and the actual plot is that she is trying to find this missing billionaire CEO for one of her childhood friends. It's his dad, and so she's trying to go on this hunt to find him, and there's like a cash prize, but that's not super like important to the story. But most of the story is very character-based, driven around Aza, her OCD, her thought spirals, and just stuff like that. And this was a very different book for me. Like, I love John Green books, but with it talking about, you know, OCD and mental health struggles, it was a very different book in that sense. And I really, really enjoyed Aza's narration and her experiences as someone who struggles with a mental disorder like OCD. Even though I don't have OCD myself, I do have other mental health issues with like anxiety, depression, ADHD, other things that result in similar thought spirals that Aza has. But yeah, I definitely really enjoyed this book this year. Next book, number 23, is Wallflower by Samantha Lee. And this is a hockey romance. It follows Cord, who is the hockey player, and Violet, who ends up being Cord's summer assistant at his like family ranch. It's very like small town, grumpy sunshine. I just really enjoyed this book. It had like every trope that I love in a romance book. It was just like a really fun read at the time, and so definitely one of my favorite books this year. And I hope that she publishes another book in the series soon, because it's supposed to be a series, but there's no real information on what it's called, who it follows, anything like that. So I hope there's more information released about that soon. And then book number 23 of my favorite books of this year is Percy Jackson and the Chalice of the Gods by Rick Riordan. This is I don't know whether to call it the first book or the 6th book, because it's like the first book in like the continuation trilogy of Percy Jackson, and it follows Percy trying to get into college at New Rome University, but it's still like a continuation of the original 5-book series. So I don't know what to call it, but it is a book as part of the original Percy Jackson series. And like I said, it follows the entire like next 3 books follow Percy trying to get into New Rome University and specifically getting recommendation letters from the gods. And so this book followed him trying to get a recommendation letter from Iris, maybe? I forget specifically which god that he's trying to get the rec letter from, but this book had to make it on my top books of this year list just because it was so fun and nostalgic to be back in this world again, be back in Percy's voice again, because I grew up reading the Percy Jackson books, and it was just so nice to be back in this world and seeing more of Percy and Annabeth's relationship, getting to see Grover again, because for some reason Rick, I think, just forgot that Grover existed as a character, because beyond one of the books in the Trials of Apollo, he's just like never seen or mentioned ever again. And so it's nice to see Grover again and see just like general quests again like this. It was just such a fun time. And I am hopefully going to read the seventh book, I don't know, Wrath of the Triple Goddess, either this month or in the new year. And then book number 21 is Wild Love by L.C. Silver. It is the first book in the Rose Hill series, and it follows Ford, who is like the son of a drummer from a rock band, and comes back to Rose Hill to open his own like song producing company, whatever that's called. And then Rosie, who I don't know if it's like childhood friends, they just like they knew each other growing up, and she comes back home after getting fired from her job, and so it follows kind of their story. And I really loved this book. I honestly thought it would end up higher on my list, but then I've just read so many good books this year that it was hard to put this one above them. But I really loved this book. I always love L.C. Silver's books. I don't care how long they are. They're just always really well done. The like spicy scenes are never too much. They're like always the right amount, and it just was such a fun little cute like read. Oh, and I guess the other part of it that I've read it is a single dad sort of romance in a way, that in the sense that I've talked about this before, but he donated sperm in college so that he could get money to go to a concert, and his quote-unquote daughter that he birthed, I guess, comes knocking on his door when she's like 12, because her adopted dad, or not really adopted, but because her actual dad had just passed away, and her mom was really struggling mentally, and so she goes to live with him, and he kind of helps take care of her and her mom. And so it's kind of like a single dad romance in that sense, but I really loved her as a character as well, because she's just a very like punk, like rebellious teenager. It was just a really fun dynamic to read about, so I really, really enjoyed that book. And then book number 20 is Set the Record Straight by Hannah Bonham Young, and this is a book I actually just read this month. It was just like a short like holiday novella actually that I listened to on audiobook, and it is a lesbian romance, which I always love. I need to really read more of those because I forget how much I loved lesbian romances until I read them. And it is a childhood friends to lovers, like fake dating, bisexual awakening, like lesbian holiday romance. It was such a fun time. It follows, I believe, Clara and Evan, and Evan is like out as, I believe, a lesbian. I could be wrong, but she is out, but she ended up getting kicked out of her home when she came out to her parents, and so she has just strong feelings about going back home and, you know, stuff like that. She's had this long-time crush on her childhood friend, Clara, who fully believes that she's straight until the whole fake dating scheme, and it kind of awakens that for Clara. And it was just such a fun time. I love a fake dating romance, and lesbian fake dating is even better. It was just so fun and heartwarming, and I feel like I need to read more stories like this because it was so fun. And then book 18 is The Heartbreaker by Sarah Kate, and this is the third book in the Good Brothers series and follows, don't remember their names, that's fine, but there's the teacher and Sadie, who falls pregnant by a different guy, is in his class in college, not high school, college, and he ends up offering to give her a place to live during the duration of this pregnancy. And like any other Sarah Kate book, it is full of, you know, smut, like BDSM elements, and it was so fun. I love every book that Sarah Kate writes, whether it's a favorite of all time or not. I love every book that she writes. I feel like she does a very good balance of romance and emotion and smut. Like, I feel like it's always really well done. And so I definitely recommend this series if that's the kind of stuff that you're into. I really liked this book. I don't know if it was my favorite in the series, just because like student teacher, even if it's college, is not my absolute favorite trope, but it still, I feel like, was one of my favorites this year, obviously, because it made the list. And then book 16 of my favorite books of this year is An Absolutely Remarkable Thing by Hank Green. And I feel like I've talked about how much I like this book before. It basically follows April May, who discovers these aliens called Carls, or that she names them Carls, and is like the first person to discover them and ends up going viral on YouTube and like the social internet because of these aliens. And it just really explores the concept of what it means to go viral, how it affects you as a person and your morals and your sense of self. And it just felt like very, very well done. I felt like I liked it more for the social commentary even than the sci-fi elements, even though those were also really interesting and kind of like a mystery way in a sense, like the way it was written. And I know there's a sequel that I really need to get to, but I don't know, because the way that this book ended, I don't want to spoil it obviously, but I don't know what else could be told in a sequel, and the book is like twice as long. So we'll see. I hopefully will read that next year, but yeah, definitely one of my favorite books this year. And then book 15 is Fir Line by Maggie C. Gates, and this is the third book in the Griffith Brothers trilogy and easily my favorite in the series. It follows, I believe, Lenny, and I keep forgetting the men's name in these books. I don't know why, but it follows Lenny and a guy. I could easily look it up. I just do not feel like it. But it follows those two, and she is basically a chef for the Griffith farm, and the Griffith brother that this follows is very against changing the farm. He never wants anything to change. He wants things to stay the exact same forever and ever, not realizing, you know, things are going to have to change if you want to keep the farm going and keep making a profit so it doesn't shut down because you're losing so much money. But it follows those two and kind of their relationship. I think he ends, if I remember correctly, she ends up actually living out of her car. So he offers her a place to stay until she can kind of get on her feet and that kind of thing. It's just enemies to lovers. They really do not get along. Oh, it's so good though. That book was so good. Next book, book 14, is Thunderhead by Neil Shusterman. So this is one instance where I'm only allowed to include one book in the series because I read both Scythe and Thunderhead this year, and easily Thunderhead was my favorite of those two. And I don't want to get too much into the plot of this book specifically because it very much spoils like all of Scythe, but basically it is a world where people no longer die of natural causes or unnatural causes. Like plane crashes don't happen, car accidents don't happen, and if they somehow do, you don't die, you become dead-ish, where you then go to the hospital to be revived, basically. But in order to maintain balance of the world's population, they have what are called scythes that then glean people. They call it gleaning instead of killing. They're basically killing people to keep the world's population in balance so it doesn't become too overgrown with too many people. So then the main plot is that there's two people, Anastasia and Rowan, who become apprentices of a scythe, and it just kind of follows that story. And this book easily was my favorite of the two, just because there's something that happens at the end of Scythe that is really then explored in this book. You learn about a third character, or you follow a third character in this book as well, and this book is just so good. And then book 13 is Swift and Saddled by Lila Sage, which is the second book in the Rebel Blue Ranch series, and it follows Ada and West. West is one of the like Ryder brothers on the ranch, and Ada is an interior designer who is hired to help West with one of his projects that he's been assigned on the farm. And actually the way this book starts is that she hooks up with some guy in a bar, not realizing that the guy she hooked up with was West because she assumed that the person she'd be working for was West's dad. She just assumed it would be the oldest guy. And so she had no idea that she slept with the person that she'd be working for. And I loved this book. I love this whole series, but this book, very, very good. There has like a little bit of enemies to lovers elements, kind of a forced proximity in a sense, just because they have to work together. But it just felt like their relationship progressed so naturally, it seemed like. And there was no third act breakup, which I love when there's no third act breakup in a book, because unless the third act breakup is done really well, but usually it's just because of miscommunication. And so the fact that there wasn't that in this book was a nice, refreshing moment. But yeah, easily like a 4.5 stars for me, I think. I loved this book. Book number 12 is I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy. And this is the only nonfiction book that on this list, because it is the only nonfiction book that I read this year. And I listened to an audiobook read by Jeanette McCurdy herself, which I highly recommend for anybody who wants to read this book. Listen to it on audio because she does a really good job as the narrator. And this book basically follows Jeanette McCurdy telling her life story, basically, talking about her abusive relationship with her mother and her history with eating disorders and substance abuse and working in the entertainment industry as a child, being a child actor. And it's just so heartbreaking and emotional, but also just beautifully written, that it had to make my top list of favorite books this year because it was just I think about it all the time. And then next is Wild Eyes by Elsie Silver, which is the second book in the Rose Hill series, and I absolutely devoured that book even more. So it follows Weston, who is basically like a horse trainer, I guess. He kind of takes care of trouble horses who come to him that have been like abused and starved, and he kind of gets them back into a good lifestyle, that kind of thing. And then I forget the female character's name, but she's like a big pop star who runs away after, basically, there's a lot of backstory. I won't get into it just because I don't want to spoil it, but she just runs away and runs into Weston after trying to take a picture of a grizzly bear and almost dying. If he hadn't saved her, she probably would have died. And he's a single dad as well with 2 kids, and it was just so well done. I loved this book even more than the first one. It had a bit of like enemies to lovers vibes, but it was so heartwarming. I absolutely loved the relationships that she had with his kids too, especially Oliver. And I just felt like the way that the relationship progressed was so natural. And I don't know, and I also loved the little cameos from Rosie and Ford from the first book too, because they are basically next door neighbors. And this book was just so fun and cute, and I loved this book. And finally, we are in my top 10 books of the year, which these are not necessarily in rank order, but for the most part, I think they're in rank order. And number 10 is Butcher and Blackbird by Brynn Weaver. And I am so glad I finally read this book because it's been on my list for a while, because I really like serial killer romances, but this is very different type, like a very different type of serial killer romance compared to what you usually see. Both of them are serial killers actually that kill other serial killers. So that was a very different take on this genre. It's a like friends to lovers dark romance, but also hilarious. It was very funny, and I really enjoyed this book. I have not laughed out loud about a book in a while, and it's just so good. And then book number 9 is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by B.E. Schwab, which might shock you because I feel like I've talked about this book so much about how much I love it, and it's my new favorite book. So you expect it to be my favorite book of the year, but after like really looking at the books that I read this year, it was hard to put this one above some of the others, because as much as I did love this book, like I absolutely love this book, there were just some books that really impacted me a little bit different. So like, don't get me wrong, definitely a new favorite book of all time, but very different in a lot of the other books that I read this year, just because it was very like, it made me cry. Like that's how much it affected me. The ending made me cry. But anyway, this book basically follows Addie LaRue, who gives up her soul to a demon so that she doesn't have to marry a guy that she doesn't want to marry. And it basically then follows her like living through time. She gives up her mortality, so she's never gonna die. This book, very well written, again, made me cry. I read through it pretty quickly. It's like literally the only book that I've annotated this year because that's how much I loved it. And so like, obviously I love this book. It's just not my favorite of the year, even though, again, I absolutely adored this book. And then book 8 is surprisingly a book I just finished like 2 days ago. Like I'm surprised I loved it so much to jump it up this high on the list. And that is Keep Me by Sarah Kate, which is the start of a new series about like Scottish romances. And I listened to this on audio, and I really didn't think it was gonna make my top 10 because it took me like a whole week to finish, which is not normal for romance books, especially Sarah Kate books, but I think it's just because it was on audio and the audio narrators were my favorite. And the only reason I read it that way is just because that's what was available first, and it actually wasn't a KU book, and all of Sarah Kate's books are usually Kindle Unlimited, so that's just kind of the way that everything felt. But regardless, this book basically follows Sylvie and Killian, and they meet originally because Sylvie breaks into his house or manor because of her boyfriend at the time figuring out that his grandfather's old typewriter was in the manor. So she broke into the manor to get a picture of it, and he catches her and then, eventually just lets her go. Well, fast forward to the future, like a couple months later, if that, she finds out that her boyfriend is cheating on her with her best friend. So there's that. And then also she has this not great relationship with her parents. And so in comes Killian's sister, Anna, who offers her $10 million to marry Killian for a year so that at the end of the year, she has rights to the deed on the manor and will sign it over to Killian and Anna's aunt. However, they're deceiving Killian because he believes that they are getting married to help like, kind of improve his image and reputation. And this book was just so good. It was such a, I love a marriage of convenience. I was a little worried going into it that I wasn't gonna love it because of like the deception, but honestly, I didn't mind it as much as I thought I would. And then book 7 is Leather and Lark by Bryn Weaver, which is the second book in the, I don't think the series is called, oh, the series is called Ruinous Love. That's what it's called. It's the second book after Butcher and Blackbird. And I loved this book even more than Butcher and Blackbird, which I didn't think I would. And it follows Lachlan and Lark. It's a marriage of convenience, enemies to lovers. It was just so good. Like, I just loved the emotion, like the emotional part of the romance, especially just because there's a really traumatic past for Lark that takes her a while to, you know, open up to Lachlan and let her walls down and just stuff like that. It was just so good, and I'm very excited for the third book. Even though it is kind of, I think, a second chance romance, I'm still very excited about it. And then book 6 on this list is Lost and Lassoed by Lila Sage, which is the third book in the Rebel Blue Ranch series and follows Teddy and Gus. And I was so excited to read this book because you get their banter and like fighting with each other in the first 2 books. And so I was so excited to read this book, and it delivered in every aspect. The enemies to lovers, the kind of emotional romance when they did finally kind of cave and, you know, let themselves fall for each other. It was just so well done, and I absolutely loved this book. Like, I feel like I could talk about it for ages. Like, I feel like Gus is like the perfect book boyfriend, and their relationship was just so beautiful. I love an enemies to lovers book, in case you couldn't tell. Like, I love that trope so much, and I don't know why. I don't know what it is, but it's just one of my favorite tropes. I think it's just because the banter is always so good, and the tension and the angst, it's just so well done. So definitely looking forward to the 4th book in the series that comes out next year. And finally, we have hit our top 5 mark. So book 5 is The Reappearance of Rachel Price by Holly Jackson. And this is the second book by Holly Jackson I read this year, and the second mystery book that I read this year, because mystery is now a genre I love, thanks to my sister. And this book follows Rachel Price, who reappeared after going missing for 16 years, and Belle, her daughter, was the only person around when she went missing. And I'm not going to go too much more in depth into that summary because there's just so many twists and turns. It's so much better to go into this book blind. But I absolutely loved this book. I read it in like 3 sittings in like 2 days, and I just flew through it. There were so many twists that I did not expect. And yeah, it was just definitely a very, very good book, and I want to read all of Holly Jackson's books now, and more mystery too, especially. And book number 4 is A Good Girl's Guide to Murder by Holly Jackson again. And this was the first Holly Jackson / mystery book that I read this year, and I liked it just a little bit more than The Reappearance of Rachel Price. I think slightly more only because of the romance. Because I feel like the mysteries were equally interesting, even though they were quite different, but there is just the romance in this book that I liked a little bit more than the one in that book. And so I don't want to go too much in depth with this book, but basically it follows Pip, who is doing her senior thesis or senior project in high school about what happened to Andy Bell, who was, I guess, a student at this high school. And everyone assumes that Robbie's brother Sal is the one who did something to her, but Pip doesn't believe it, and so she's determined to figure out the truth. And so it was just, again, so many twists and turns that I did not expect going into the story. And just like, again, if you somehow have not read this book yet, I highly recommend it. And then book 3 is Apprentice to the Villain by Hannah Nicole Mayer, which is the sequel to Assistant to the Villain. And I read both of them this year, but I just loved Apprentice to the Villain a little bit more just because it really developed more of the romance, just because it is kind of a romantic-y book, and so I read it because of the romance. It's just such a very good enemies to lovers, slow burn, like angsty romance, and I just love Tristan and Evie as characters, and their relationship it's just, there's a lot of twists that I didn't expect for it to be just a fantasy book, you know? I feel like I don't know how to explain this book because it feels like I read a lot of just vibes. I don't remember a ton about the plot. I mostly just remember absolutely loving the book and the romance specifically. So That's all I've got for this book right now. But I feel like I've talked about this book a bunch at this point. And then number 2 is Lights Out by Nevessa Allen. And this is a book I've read pretty recently on audiobook. If you haven't heard of it, you've probably been living under a rock because it is all over TikTok. And it's a like dark rom-com, similar to the vibes of Butcher and Blackbird, but not quite, because it's not quite as dark. It's a stalker romance basically, but it is just so good. I love Josh as a main character, and I love Allie as a main character and their relationship. I like low-key really want to reread it soon, but it was so good, and I loved this book, like every moment of it. It's easily a new favorite book of mine. And book number 1, which is last but definitely not least, is Supernova by Marissa Meyer. I loved this book so much. It is the 3rd book in the Renegades trilogy. I feel like I've talked about this book for ages on my channel because I've read all 3 of the books this year. So I'm not gonna hash out what it's about again because I feel like it's just getting repetitive at this point. But this book was just so good. I'm thinking about it often and thinking about Adrian and Nova's relationship every week. I loved this book. It was such a perfect conclusion to a trilogy, minus the epilogue. I've talked about that in my November wrap up. The epilogue was really irritating, but that's not the point. I pretend the epilogue doesn't exist. It's not real because this book was just perfect. I loved everything about this book. This whole series was amazing, but this book specifically was just so good, and I need everybody to read this trilogy ASAP. All right, and so that is my top 24 books that I read this year in 2024. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and I will see you next time with a new one.